There are houses where stories seem to linger in the walls, where memory itself feels as though it clings to the very beams and stones. This is one of those houses. Cairo. On the outskirts of Franklin County, Ohio, a modest farmhouse stood against the cold winds of winter. Its timbers creaked softly in the night air, and its chimney sent a proud ribbon of smoke curling above the snowy fields. Within its walls lived the Whitmore family, who had settled the land more than a decade earlier. Thomas Whitmore, broad of shoulder and steady have of hand, was known among neighbors as a man whose word carried weight. At 43, the lines on his brow spoke less of age than of years of honest labor in the soil. With his team of horses and his grain fields stretching across 100 fertile acres, he had earned the respect of his peers through quiet diligence and unshakable fairness. Beside him in both farm and family matters, stood Margaret, his wife. Her presence softened the household in ways both seen and unseen. Folks in the county spoke of her gentle remedies, her calm manner, and the skill with which she aided mothers in their hour of need. She was a figure of reassurance, one whose kindness seemed to hold its own against hardship. The Whitmores had 3 children, each a thread in the fabric of their household. Sarah, 12, carried her mother's steady patience. Mary, 6, was lively as a spring creek, filling the rooms with laughter and song. Yet it was the middle child, 9-year-old Ernest, who drew the most attention. Even among the bustle of frontier life, Ernest shone with a curious light. He possessed a mind that seemed older than his years, his pale blue eyes fixed with a depth of thought uncommon in children. Where most boys spent their hours in games of chase, Ernest preferred books borrowed from schoolmaster Cornelius Hayes, who himself admitted the lad's abilities surpassed those of students twice his age. It was not just reading and sums that set the boy apart. Farmers who came by on errands or visits sometimes brought matters for Ernest to consider. A calf refusing its milk, a garden patch refusing to sprout, and Ernest, with calm composure, would look, think, and offer some simple suggestion. To the surprise of many, his words often proved correct. At first, the talk was light-hearted. Neighbors chuckled at the boy's curious talents, calling him clever, quick, wise, beyond his years. But as time passed, the whispers carried further, and Ernest's name became known in corners of the county where the family themselves seldom traveled. Even Dr. Samuel Morrison, a physician of stern reputation and little patience for country tales, found himself impressed. He had once dismissed the boy's reputation as nothing more than gossip. Yet after seeing Ernest reason through a matter that had puzzled grown men, Morrison began to take quiet notes. Though it was clear the child possessed an unusual gift, the Whitmores raised him with plain humility. At the supper table, Thomas spoke his prayers with a bowed head, and Ernest folded his hands like the rest, saying little. When chores called, Ernest performed them with care, his slight frame moving through the barn and fields, as though he had long studied the rhythm of the land itself. Winter deepened, and the household pressed on as farm families must, chopping wood, tending animals, storing food against the cold. Snow lay across the fields, softening the land in silence, while inside the farmhouse the crackle of firelight brought warmth to the long evenings. Nothing in those first quiet weeks suggested what was to come. The Whitmore's neighbors saw only a family blessed with healthy children, a prosperous farm, and a bright young boy whose mind reached beyond his years. Yet within that small home, unseen by those passing on the snowy road, threads were being woven that would one day form a tale unlike any other. And for now, the family knew only peace. The calm before the first ripple disturbed the still waters of their lives. The evening of November 15th brought a chill that rattled the door windows and drove the Whitmores to gather early around their table. The lamps were lit, casting a soft amber glow upon the room. The smell of bread and stewed vegetables filled the air, while the fire cracked gently in the hearth. All seemed as it should be, with Thomas offering grace, Margaret serving portions, and the children seated neatly at their places. Ernest, though, appeared distant. His fork rested idly upon his plate, and his gaze wandered past the table toward some fixed point beyond the reach of ordinary sight. His sisters whispered to each other, uncertain, while Margaret leaned closer, gently calling her son's name. The boy did not stir. His hands, usually restless in small motions of thought or curiosity, had grown still. His lips parted ever so slightly, as though he had begun to speak, yet no sound escaped. A pale hue touched his cheeks, and his chest rose and fell in an even, shallow rhythm. "You." Tolamas exchanged a glance with his wife. "The lad's weary," he murmured, though there was a faint quaver in his voice. "It's naught but a long day." But Margaret's hand trembled as she brushed the hair from Ernest's forehead. The boy's skin was cool, cooler than the draught that crept under the door. She drew back with unease, uncertain whether to disturb him further. The family sat in uneasy quiet, save for the ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional snap of the fire. Minutes passed, though they felt longer, each one weighed with a silence that pressed upon the room. At length, Thomas rose and placed his broad hand upon Ernest's shoulder. The boy gave no sign of recognition. His eyes, unblinking, remained fixed upon a place that none could follow. With growing concern, Thomas lifted Ernest gently from his chair and carried him toward the bedchamber. Word of the matter soon reached Dr. Morrison, who arrived before the week was out. A man of stern manner and sharp features, he had tended families in the county for 2 decades. He prided himself on steady judgment, and though often dismissive of country gossip, he respected the Whitmores enough to answer their call with haste. Upon entering the house, Morrison found Ernest seated quietly by the hearth. The boy's face bore no sign of distress, save for a weariness that seemed to press upon his frame. When spoken to, he answered slowly, with a calmness that belied his years. Thomas recounted the incident in measured tones, careful not to overstate. Margaret, however, could not hide her worry. She described the stillness, the cold touch of the boy's skin, the long silence that had overtaken him. Her voice faltered more than once, and her eyes glistened as she spoke. Morrison listened without interruption, his hands folded behind his back. At last, he knelt before Ernest and studied him with a critical gaze. He asked questions, simple ones of name, age, and memory of the supper table. Ernest answered each with clarity, yet when pressed to recall the long moments of his stillness, he merely shook his head. The physician then placed his hand upon the boy's wrist, counting the faint pulse with practiced attention. His brow furrowed, though he spoke no judgment aloud. Rising, he inquired about the boy's health in recent weeks, his appetite, his studies, his labors about the farm. Thomas and Margaret gave what answers they could, insisting that save for the strange incident, Ernest had shown no ailment. After a long pause, Morrison gave a short nod. "The lad may be overtaxed," he said at last. "Too much study, perhaps. A child ought to run in the fields more than pore over books." His words were meant to soothe, though his tone carried less assurance than usual. Margaret pressed him further, asking if rest alone could mend the matter. Morrison replied that rest, good nourishment, and a lightness of occupation might serve best. Yet he could not wholly mask the unease in his expression. Before departing, he set his hand once more upon Ernest's shoulder and looked into the boy's steady eyes. "You'll be well, lad," he said, though it sounded more a hope than a certainty. Then, with hat in hand, he took his leave, promising to return should there be further need. That night, the Whitmores lay wakeful in their beds. The stillness of the farmhouse pressed heavy upon them, and though the lamps had long since been extinguished, Margaret rose more than once to look in upon her son. Each time she found him sleeping peacefully, yet her heart found little comfort. In the days that followed, whispers began to stir among the neighbors. Though the Whitmores had spoken to none but Morrison, word traveled in ways unseen, and soon questions were carried from one homestead to another. Why had the boy sat unmoving? What had he seen, or felt, or heard? Some dismissed it as childish faintness, while others, with voices lowered, wondered if there was more to be told. The Whitmores themselves spoke little of it, choosing instead to busy their hands with work. Yet, within their household, the memory lingered. a moment of strangeness that could not easily be explained away. The days shortened swiftly as December came upon the valley, and the Whitmore household grew accustomed to the long evenings gathered close by the fire. Margaret kept her hands busy with sewing, Thomas with mending tools or sharpening blades for the winter's work. The girls played with scraps of cloth or hushed games upon the floor. Ernest, as ever, sat with a book, though his gaze often wandered from the page to the flames. Quite on the third day of December, while the afternoon light faded beyond the frosted panes, another strange moment. It came without warning, as sudden as the closing of a door. He was reading aloud to his sisters, his voice clear and measured, when, in the space of a breath, his tone faltered. The words trailed away into silence, and the book slipped from his hands to the rug. "Oh," the sisters looked at him in confusion. "Ernest?" one asked softly. He did not answer, his eyes fixed upon the far wall, unblinking, as though all thought had departed. Margaret rushed to his side, her needle falling forgotten into the basket. She knelt, calling his name, shaking him gently by the shoulder. His body remained upright, steady, but unresponsive. The stillness was so complete, it seemed as though time itself had been suspended around him. Thomas, hearing his wife's cry, came quickly from his chair. He lifted the boy and laid him upon the settee, loosening his collar. Margaret pressed her hand to Ernest's brow, but again found it cool to the touch, almost unnaturally so. His lips parted, yet no sound came forth. The sisters clung to one another, frightened by their brother's sudden silence. Margaret hushed them, though her own face bore fear she could not hide. She whispered prayers beneath her breath, her voice trembling as she stroked Ernest's hair. Idle minutes passed, though to the family they felt unending. The fire crackled, the wind pressed against the shutters, and still Ernest lay motionless, his gaze vacant and strange. Thomas paced the floor, his jaw set tight, glancing often at the clock as though measuring each passing second. At last, without stir or warning, Ernest gave a small shiver. His eyelids fluttered, and his chest rose with a deeper breath. He blinked, then turned his eyes toward his mother, who still knelt beside him. "Why art thou weeping, mother?" he asked quietly, his voice tender and puzzled. Margaret caught her breath and pressed her hand to her lips. Tears slipped from her eyes as she embraced him, scarcely able to speak. "Thou wert gone from us, child," she whispered. "We called thee, yet thou didst not answer." Ernest looked at her with bewilderment. "Gone? I but read to the girls. Did I not finish the page?" The sisters cried out that he had not, that he had fallen silent without warning. Ernest shook his head, saying he remembered nothing of it. To him, it was as though the moment had never been. Thomas laid a steady hand upon his son's shoulder. "Dost thou feel ill, lad?" Ernest answered softly. "No, father, I feel no harm at all." Though his words carried reassurance, the shadow of unease remained. Margaret guided him to rest in his bed, where he soon drifted into slumber. Yet she sat long beside him, fearful that another spell might steal him from her again. The next morning, Ernest rose cheerful, speaking of his books and lessons with his usual thoughtfulness. He showed no weakness, no sign of distress. The family, though grateful for his vigor, could not shake the memory of the stillness that had overtaken him. Whispers spread further through the small community. A neighbor's child, passing near the window that evening, had glimpsed the scene, Margaret kneeling, Thomas pacing, the boy lying pale upon the settee. The tale was soon told from one household to another, gathering speculation with each telling. Some declared it fainting, others a curious illness of the nerves. A few lowered their voices, suggesting mysteries best left unspoken. Within the Whitmore home, Thomas resolved to hold firm. He instructed the children to speak little of the matter, and when neighbors inquired, he answered in short, steady tones that Ernest was well enough. Margaret obeyed his wish, though her heart yearned for counsel. She longed to send word again to Dr. Webb or even Morrison, yet Thomas urged caution. "Let us not have the boy made a wonder," he said. "We shall watch him ourselves," Margaret yielded, but her nights grew restless. "We please." She rose often from her bed to stand at Ernest's door, listening for his breath, watching for any stir in the dim lamplight. Each time she found him sleeping peacefully, yet her unease never fully departed. For Ernest himself, life seemed untroubled. He carried his books with him, speaking of numbers, verses, and tales with enthusiasm. If asked about the strange stillness, he could offer nothing, for to him there was nothing to recall. The memory belonged to his family, not to him. Thus the days passed into deeper winter. The 17th day of December dawned with a pale sun, its light stretched thin across the valley, glimmering faintly upon frost that clung to every fence and hedge. The Whitmore household stirred slowly, for the winter season pressed all to quieter labors. Yet beneath the calm surface, unease lingered, woven into each hour by the memory of Ernest's curious stillness. Margaret, unable to bear her silent fears, had pressed Thomas once more to summon Dr. Webb. At length he agreed, for though he guarded his son's dignity with great care, he could not deny the weight of his wife's pleading eyes. A messenger was dispatched, and Webb promised his arrival that very week. When the appointed day came, the sound of carriage wheels broke the stillness of the afternoon. The family rose to receive their guest, and the physician entered with his customary gentleness, brushing frost from his coat and stamping the cold from his boots. Margaret welcomed him with warmth, ushering him quickly toward the fire, while Thomas offered a firm handshake. The children watched in quiet awe, for though Webb carried no air of severity, his presence commanded respect. Ernest, seated at the table with his book, looked up and offered a polite greeting. Webber's eyes lingered upon the boy, studying him with careful attention before he spoke. After pleasantries were exchanged, Webb was soon drawn aside to hear the latest account. Margaret, her voice unsteady, told of Ernest's sudden lapse a fortnight past, how he had faltered in his reading, fallen silent, and seemed absent to all around him. She spoke of his cold brow, his vacant gaze, and the long minutes in which no word nor stir could be drawn from him. Her voice broke as she recalled the fear that gripped her heart, and she pressed her handkerchief to her lips to keep her composure. Thomas stood beside her, his words measured and restrained. He added what he had observed, noting that the boy had returned to himself without harm, showing vigor the following morning. Yet his brow furrowed as he spoke, betraying a concern he did not wish to reveal too plainly. Webb listened intently, neither interrupting nor showing alarm. When Margaret had finished, he nodded gravely and turned once more to Ernest. The boy, though aware of the attention fixed upon him, did not shrink back. He closed his book and folded his hands neatly upon the table, awaiting the physician's questions. "Now, tell me, lad," Webb began gently, "dost thou recall that evening? The reading, the sudden silence?"
Cal.
Ernest shook his head. "I do not, sir. I remember reading to my sisters, and naught else. They say I ceased, but to me it is as if I but turned a page." Webb regarded him closely. "Hast thou felt weariness at thy tasks, or heaviness in thy limbs?" Ernest replied. "No, sir," Ernest replied. "I feel no weight nor ache. I rise each morning with ease." "Dreams, then? Strange fancies in thy sleep?" Ernest thought a moment. "I dream of books, sir, of numbers and tales, nothing more." Webb gave a faint smile, though his eyes remained thoughtful. He asked further questions. Each answered with clarity. Then he placed his hand upon the boy's brow, lifted his chin to look into his eyes, and took his pulse with practiced care. Ernest bore each measure calmly, neither restless nor afraid. At length Webb rose, drawing Thomas and Margaret aside. "The lad is strong," he said in a low voice. "I find no sign of weakness in his frame. Yet his mind, I think, moves with uncommon swiftness. He ponders deeply, perhaps more than is fitting for his years. Such inward turning may account for these curious lapses. I would not yet call it peril, but it should be watched with care." Margaret clutched at his sleeve. "But what shall we do, sir? How may we keep him safe?" "Let him not dwell wholly in his books," Webb advised. "Give him hours in the open air." Bid him walk the fields, labor lightly with his father, play freely with his sisters. Let his mind be balanced with the simple joys of youth. Should another spell return, send for me at once. Until then, let him rest in the bosom of his family, and let no fear shadow him unduly. Ickle Margaret's eyes brimmed with tears, yet she nodded gratefully, saying, "Yeah, we shall follow thy counsel." Right when Webb prepared to take his leave, Ernest rose and walked with him to the door. The physician paused, laying a hand upon the boy's shoulder. "Remember, Ernest," he said softly, "a mind is a fine gift, but it must not be driven as one drives a weary beast. Let it wander the meadow as well as the book. The world is wider than the page." All, Ernest looked up at him with quiet seriousness. "I shall try, sir." Webb smiled, though faintly, and with a final bow to Margaret and clasp of Thomas's hand, he departed into the wintry dusk. The family stood in silence a long moment after the door closed. Margaret leaned against Thomas, weary from the weight of her cares, while he held her gently, his eyes fixed. The new year entered the valley with little fanfare. The fields lay silent beneath their covering of frost, and the trees stood bare and unmoving, their branches black against the winter sky. The Whitmore family pressed on with their simple labors, but the hush of the season seemed to rest heavily upon the household. Margaret, in particular, bore the stillness with unease, for though Ernest appeared in good health, the memory of his strange lapses would not release her mind. It was on the 4th day of January that Dr. Webb returned, having promised Margaret that he would call again. His carriage creaked along the frozen road, wheels cutting shallow ruts in the brittle earth. The sound carried through the air, and soon the Whitmores gathered at the window, watching as the familiar figure stepped down and made his way to the door. Old Thomas welcomed him gravely, shaking the frost from his coat. Margaret followed, her eyes filled with both relief and worry. The children gathered near the hearth, speaking in hushed tones, while Ernest sat quietly with a book upon his knee, his brow furrowed in thought. Webb's gaze fell at once upon the boy. He bowed his head slightly in greeting, then allowed himself to be led into the sitting room, where a fire burned low in the grate. The family arranged themselves with a kind of solemn respect, for though Webb bore no lofty airs, his presence lent the room a weight all its own. "You tell me," the physician said, settling into his chair, "how fares our young scholar?" Margaret clasped her hands tightly. "He has been well enough, sir, yet my heart trembles each day. I rise in the night to listen at his door, lest he fall again into that dreadful stillness." Thomas placed a steady hand upon her arm. "He has shown vigor, Webb. Webb. He works beside me, he runs with his sisters, and he eats heartily, yet still the memory lingers." Webb nodded, then turned to Ernest. "And thou, lad, how dost thou find thyself since last we spoke?" Ernest lifted his eyes with composure. "I feel no ailment, sir. My mind is clear, and I study each day. If my mother fears, it is not for any weakness I can name." Webb's expression softened. "It is often so that others carry our burdens when we cannot see them ourselves. Still, I would look more closely if thou art willing." The boy inclined his head. "I am willing, sir." Thus began a long afternoon of careful observation. Webb questioned Ernest about his readings, his pastimes, his thoughts by day, and his dreams by night. The boy answered each with honesty, though at times his replies wandered into curious reflections on the nature of numbers, or the meaning of verses he had studied. Margaret listened with awe, hearing in her son's words a depth that seemed beyond his years. Thomas, though proud, grew uneasy, for he feared such intensity might indeed consume the lad's strength. After questioning, Webb bade Ernest walk the length of the room to measure his step and balance. He asked him to hold out his hands, to recite passages, to solve simple reckonings. Ernest obeyed without hesitation, his eyes bright with intelligence, his movements steady and calm. Yet Webb, watching keenly, noted something the others did not, a fleeting distance in the boy's gaze, as though at times he looked not upon the room itself, but into some inward chamber hidden from all others. The physician said nothing of it, but it troubled him. When the tasks were done, Webb requested a private word with Thomas and Margaret. Ernest withdrew obediently, taking his book to the far corner, where he sat with quiet patience. Keel, the physician, lowered his voice. The boy is sound of body. His pulse is firm, his breath unlabored, his frame strong. Yet his mind, his mind runs swiftly, perhaps too swiftly. It may be that in his deep pondering he withdraws from the world for moments, losing sight of those around him. Such a turn may bring the stillness you have described. Margaret clasped her hands more tightly, her knuckles pale. Is it a danger, sir? Will it pass, or will it return again and again? Webb considered. It may pass with time if guided rightly, or it may deepen should he be left to brood untempered. Therefore I counsel balance, keep his mind from dwelling solely upon books. Let him labor in the fields, breathe the air of the hills, and take joy in simple fellowship. Do not deny him study, but do not let it consume him. Thomas listened intently. We shall heed thy counsel. Yet tell me plain, dost thou believe this ailment will shorten his days? Webb's brow furrowed. I cannot say so. I see no wasting in his frame, only this tendency to retreat within. If well guided, he may outgrow it. If left unchecked, it may trouble him further. But there is no mark of death upon him. Margaret wept softly, overcome with both fear and hope. Thomas drew her close, his own face grave. When Webb prepared to depart, Ernest rose and approached him. The physician laid a hand upon the boy's shoulder, meeting his eyes. Remember what I have told thee, Ernest. Thou art gifted, but gifts must be tended with care. Walk among the living as well as among the pages of thy books. The boy bowed his head. I shall try, sir. Webb's gaze lingered upon him a moment longer. Then he turned, bidding the family farewell. His carriage rattled away into the frozen dusk, leaving the Whitmores standing silent in the doorway, each lost in thought. The days that followed carried a subtle change. Margaret strove to keep Ernest more often in the fields or at play with his sisters. Thomas set him small tasks beside him in the barn, guiding his hands with patient firmness. Ernest obeyed willingly, though his mind often strayed back to his books, his eyes shining whenever he spoke of them. Yet, when the winter sun touched the snow, or the wind stirred through the bare trees, a quiet peace would sometimes fall upon him, as though he were learning to divide his heart between the world of thought and the world of earth. Thus the household passed into the deep of winter, bearing their burden of watchfulness, yet clinging also to hope. The days moved quietly through the middle of January. Snow lay heavy upon the ground, muffling the sounds of the village road and the fields beyond. The Whitmores, accustomed now to the deep cold, carried on with their tasks. Margaret stitched by the window, her hands steady though her heart still bent with unease. Thomas kept to his labor with calm resolve, while the children filled the rooms with gentle play. It was upon the 12th day of the month that Dr. Webb returned once more. His carriage wheels creaked over the frozen ruts, and the sound drew Margaret at once to the window. She called softly for Ernest, who rose from his book and followed her to the door. The physician entered with his usual quiet presence. He removed his gloves, brushing away the frost, and greeted them with words of warmth. How fares the household? He asked, his eyes glancing toward the boy. Thomas answered plainly, We have had peace, Webb. No spells have shown themselves since thy last visit. The lad works beside me, and he reads with vigor. Webb nodded. This is well, yet I will see him again, if thou art willing. They gathered in the small parlor, where the fire burned low but steady. Margaret guided Ernest forward, her hand resting lightly upon his shoulder. The boy stood calm, meeting the physician's gaze with quiet strength. Webb questioned him gently. Hast thou felt the stillness return, lad? Any moments when thy thoughts wander too far away? You? Ernest shook his head. None that I recall, sir. I rise, I study, I walk with father, and I sleep soundly. If my mother fears, it is not for 'cause I can name. Margaret pressed her hands together, listening with both relief and worry. He speaks truth, sir. Yet each day I wait, fearing the silence may steal upon him again. Cold Webb drew nearer, lifting Ernest's hand in his own. He studied the boy's pulse, then the clarity of his eyes. "He appears sound," the physician said at last. "Yet I would counsel thee still, let not his mind dwell wholly in books. Encourage him to walk, to labor, to speak freely of simple things. Balance is the surest guard." Here Thomas inclined his head. "We have done as thou didst bid us. He labors in the barn and carries wood. Yet when work is finished, he seeks his books at once." Webb's mouth curved faintly, neither smile nor frown. Such is the nature of the studious. It is not to be crushed, but to be guided. "I see no harm today, yet thou must keep watch. The boy's gift is bright, and bright flames require care, lest they consume the wick too swiftly." Ill Ernest listened, though his brow furrowed. "I mean no trouble, sir. I only love my books." Webb placed a steady hand upon his shoulder. "No trouble, lad. It is no sin to love knowledge. But thou must remember also to love the fields, the hearth, and the common fellowship of thy kin." The boy bowed his head. "I will remember." Ika Margaret's eyes glistened as she looked upon them, her heart caught between fear and pride. She longed to speak further, but Thomas touched her hand, bidding her trust the counsel already given. Webb lingered only a short while longer, asking after the welfare of the younger children and the household's needs. At last he gathered his gloves and cloak, preparing for departure. Before he stepped out, he turned once more to Ernest. "Keep thy balance, lad," he said softly. "The mind is a noble servant, but the heart must guide it." Ernest met his gaze with quiet solemnity. "I shall try, sir." With that, Webb departed into the cold twilight. The family watched as his carriage rolled away across the frozen ground, its wheels fading into the hush of snow. Within the farmhouse, the fire glowed faintly, and the stillness of winter closed once more around them. The waning of January brought no thaw. Snow lay upon the village lanes, hardened by the tread of carts and boots, until it gleamed like beaten stone. The Whitmores, accustomed to the labor of winter, bore the season with patience, though Margaret's spirit yet bent beneath its weight. Her eye was ever turned toward Ernest, watching each movement, each pause, as though the shadow of silence might fall upon him again. On the 24th day, Dr. Webb returned. His carriage drew slowly to the gate, the wheels muffled in snow, the horse's breath rising in pale clouds. Margaret hastened to meet him, her face pale with both relief and apprehension. "You do us kindness, sir," she said as he stepped down. "I come to fulfill my promise," Webb replied gently. "The boy weighs upon thy heart, and so I must weigh more carefully upon mine." They entered the house, where the fire crackled low upon the hearth. Thomas greeted the physician with firm respect, while Ernest stood quietly by the window, his book closed in his hands. The boy's eyes followed Webb with an air of calm composure, though within them flickered a light not easily read. The physician removed his cloak and gloves, then seated himself in the familiar parlor. "Let us speak plainly," he said. "What changes have passed since last I came?" Thomas answered with steady voice. "The lad shows vigor in his labor. He takes to the axe, the shovel, the carrying of wood, with no sign of weakness. He eats well and rests at night. No spells have seized him." Margaret clasped her hands tightly. "Yet still I fear, sir. When he studies, his gaze grows far away, as though he hears some voice not ours. I call, and at times he does not answer until I touch his arm." Webb turned toward Ernest. "And how dost thou account for this, lad? Hast thou felt thyself drawn into thought so deeply that the world about thee slips away?" The boy's expression held no shame. "It is true, sir. When I read, it seems as though the words are not only before my eyes, but within me. I forget the room, the fire, the voices around, yet I return when I am called." Webb studied him with care. "And dost thou remember all that thou readest?" I do, sir. The verses stay with me, even in sleep. They follow me into the morning." Margaret shuddered faintly, for such words deepened both her wonder and her dread. Webb leaned forward. This is a sign of uncommon memory and thought. It is no weakness, yet it carries its own peril. The mind that holds too much may find it heavy to bear. Still I see no failing in thy frame, no mark of decline. Thou art strong, Ernest. Yet strength must be guarded. The boy bowed his head slightly. I shall try to keep my balance, as thou hast told me before. For a time Webb questioned him further, his dreams, his tasks in the barn, his walks in the fields. Ernest answered each with clarity, though often his words wandered into reflections upon the order of the heavens or the harmony of numbers. Margaret listened in silence, torn between pride and unease. At length Webb sat back, drawing a slow breath. I see no malady of the body. His vigor is plain. What troubles him lies in the course of his thoughts. It is not an illness, but a tendency. If guided aright, it may lift him. If left untended, it may lead him into solitude too deep. Thomas met his gaze firmly. Then we must guide him. Tell us, plain Webb, what more can we do? Oh, keep him in fellowship, the physician replied. Let him labor with thee, play with his sisters, walk in the winter air. Let him read, but draw him often from the page into the common world. Teach him that knowledge is not a chamber apart, but a lamp to light the path among men. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. It shall be so if we can but hold him. Webb rose, placing a hand gently upon her arm. Fear not overmuch. Thy watchfulness is already his safeguard. Love is a surer remedy than any draught. He turned then to Ernest, who had listened with quiet gravity. Remember, lad, thy gift is bright, but brightness must not blind thee to the hearth at which thou art warmed. Hold fast to thy family as well as to thy books. Ernest looked up with solemn eyes. I will remember, sir. Webb lingered only a short while longer, offering a few words of cheer to the younger children, then took his leave. The carriage wheels creaked once more along the frozen road, and the family watched until he was lost among the drifting snow. Within the farmhouse, the fire glowed faintly, and Margaret drew Ernest close, her heart torn between fear and hope. Thomas, ever steady, laid his hand upon the boy's shoulder, silently vowing to keep him balanced between earth and thought. The first days of February passed with little change upon the land. The fields lay silent beneath their covering of snow, the air so still that the smoke from chimneys rose straight into the sky before vanishing in the gray. Within the Whitmore home, life moved steadily. Thomas kept to his labors, Margaret watched with ever-present care, and Ernest divided his hours between duty and study. It was on the 6th of the month that Dr. Webb returned. His carriage rolled slowly along the frozen track, the wheels cutting through ice with a sound sharp enough to carry to the farmhouse door. Margaret, hearing it, set aside her sewing at once and called softly to Thomas. He stepped outside, coat fastened against the cold, and welcomed the physician with a handshake firm and plain. I trust this day finds thee well, Whitmore, Webb said as he alighted. We fare as we are given, Thomas replied. Come in and see for thyself. The physician entered, and the warmth of the hearth met him at once. The parlor bore its familiar air, Margaret with her work-basket, Ernest near the window with a book upon his knee. The boy rose politely as Webb entered, his countenance calm, his manner respectful. Good day to thee, Ernest, the physician said. Good day, sir, came the quiet reply. After brief courtesies, Webb asked to speak with Ernest alone for a little while. Thomas and Margaret withdrew, though Margaret's glance lingered upon her son with unspoken anxiety. The room grew hushed. Webb seated himself near the hearth and motioned for Ernest to sit opposite. Tell me plainly, lad, he began, how have thy days passed since last we spoke? Ernest folded his hands. Peaceably, sir. I work with father, I read when I may, and I find no trouble in sleep or strength. Has the silence ever fallen upon thee again, the deep stillness thy mother fears? The boy shook his head. Not as before. At times I lose myself in thought, yet I am not taken from it unwillingly. I return when called. Webb studied him closely. And when thou art in such thought, what passes through thy mind? Ernest hesitated, then spoke with careful tone. I consider the order of things, the stars above, the measure of numbers, the meaning of words. It feels as though the world opens, and I must follow where it leads. Yet it is no torment. It is as though I stand within a vast hall and listen. The physician leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly in reflection. Such depth of thought is uncommon at thy years. Tell me, dost thou speak of these reflections with thy parents? Not often, Ernest answered. Mother fears when I wander so, and father prefers I speak of plain matters. I keep most within myself, yet of anger carried alording, may it grow heavier, Webb said. Would it ease thee to share such musings with me when I visit? The boy's eyes lifted, and for the first time a spark of eagerness crossed his face. It would, sir. I have longed for one who might understand. Webb inclined his head gently. Then thou mayest trust me so far. But mark this, Ernest, thought must not be thy only dwelling. A house with but one chamber soon grows narrow. Thy labor with thy father, thy fellowship with thy sisters, these are chambers also, and they keep thy mind from pressing too sorely upon itself. I will remember, the boy said softly. Webb paused, studying the lad's slight frame, the clarity of his gaze. Thy health is sound. I find no ailment in body, only the weight of thought that must be steadied. If thou keepest balance, no harm need come. At length, Webb rose and called Thomas and Margaret back into the room. He spoke with calm assurance. The boy holds strong. His body is sound, his spirit steady. His mind moves swiftly, yet it is not a sickness. It is a gift that must be guided. Continue as I have counseled thee. Labor, fellowship, and moderate study. In this path I trust he shall remain well. Margaret's eyes moistened, though she bowed her head in thanks. We are in thy debt, sir. I fear still, but thy words bring me rest. Thomas clasped Webb's hand. We shall keep thy counsel. The lad shall walk with us, not apart. Webb took his leave soon after the visit, brief, yet full of weight. As he stepped into the cold air, Margaret watched him from the doorway, her heart steadied, though not wholly free. Ernest, standing at her side, gazed out upon the white fields, silent yet composed. The carriage rolled away, its wheels grinding upon the frozen earth, until both sound and sight faded into the gray horizon. The boy turned at last, and the family re-entered their home, the fire casting its glow against the encroaching twilight. The middle of February brought with it a stillness deeper than Docalark, that which had marked the earlier days of the season. The air hung cold and heavy, muffling even the sound of footsteps upon the hard-packed snow. The Whitmore farm lay hushed beneath its white covering. Yet within the house, the daily round of labor continued as faithfully as ever. Margaret watched her son with constant care. Each morning she observed how he bore himself, whether his eye grew dim, his hand unsteady, or his spirit withdrawn. Yet, to her wonder, she saw no sign of the silence that had once fallen so darkly upon him. Ernest labored beside his father with steady arm, fetched water, split wood, and carried burdens without complaint. He read when he was permitted, yet he joined readily in the simple tasks of home. Still, Margaret's heart trembled with doubt, for memory of his former affliction lay close, and she feared the faintest shadow of its return. On the 18th day of the month, Dr. Webb came again. His arrival was marked by the crunch of wheels upon frozen ground, and the sharp cry of the horse's breath in the icy air. Thomas met him at the gate, his countenance grave yet respectful. "Welcome once more, Webb," he said, extending a hand. "And I am glad to be here," the physician replied. "The matter of the boy is not one I take lightly." They entered together, greeted at once by the warmth of the hearth and the quiet presence of Margaret, who had risen at the sound of the carriage. Ernest stood nearby, composed, with a book closed in his hands. His gaze, calm yet thoughtful, followed the physician with solemn recognition. Webb shed his cloak and gloves, then seated himself in the parlor. After brief courtesies, he asked once more to speak with Ernest alone. Margaret hesitated, yet yielded, and with Thomas withdrew into the adjoining room. The boy remained standing, waiting upon the physician's word. "Sit, Ernest," Webb said gently. I would hear how the days have passed since last we met. "Kill," the lad obeyed, folding his hands upon his knee. "They have been peaceful, sir. I labor with father, and I take rest without trouble. The heaviness that once overcame me has not returned." Webb studied him closely. "And thy thoughts, do they still draw thee far away, so that the world about thee seems lost?" "I sometimes," Ernest admitted, "yet I return when I am called. It is as though I walk into a long corridor of thought. I follow it, but I can still turn back when I hear my name." A faint smile touched Webb's lips. "And what dost thou find in these corridors?" The voice, Gloroft grew almost reverent. "Order, sir. Recit." "I see how one thing leads into another. In numbers, in the stars, in the words I read. It is all bound together. It seems vast, yet not fearful. I wish to know it better." Webb nodded slowly, his eyes fixed upon the lad's earnest face. "It is a strong gift to perceive so deeply, but thou must not lose thyself in it. Too much solitude of thought can draw thee away from those who love thee." "I strive to remember," Ernest said. "Father bids me work, and mother calls me to sit with them. I do not refuse." Webb leaned forward slightly. "Dost thou ever feel weariness of body after these reflections? Does thy strength fail?" "No, sir. I am as strong as before. I sleep well, and I eat what is given me." The physician sat back, satisfied that the boy's frame was not weakened. After a pause, he asked, "And thy spirit? Dost thou feel troubled or at peace?" Moment. "At peace, sir. At peace." "My heart is quiet, though my thoughts are many." Webb regarded him with calm gravity. "Then I find no illness in thee. Thy gift of mind is unusual, yet it need not harm thee if thou keep balance. Remember always to return to thy family, to the warmth of the hearth, and to the labors of the field. These things will steady thee." "I will remember," the boy said earnestly. At length Webb called for Thomas and Margaret. They re-entered, Margaret's eyes searching her son's face, as though to read in it her hope and fear. The physician addressed them both. "The lad remains well. His body is sound, his spirit tranquil. What troubles him lies, not in sickness, but in the bent of his thought. It must be guided, but it is not cause for despair. Keep him close to the household, in fellowship and in labor. Allow him his studies, yet draw him often into the common life. Thus, I believe, he shall walk in safety." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, though she bowed her head in gratitude. "Thy words are a balm, sir, though my heart still trembles, yet I will hold fast to thy counsel." Thomas gave a firm nod. "We thank thee, Webb. The boy shall not be left to wander alone." The physician rose, drawing on his cloak once more. "Then my work is lightened. I shall continue to watch, yet I am persuaded that love and steadiness are the best remedies here." He departed into the frozen twilight, his carriage creaking slowly along the snowbound road. From the doorway, the family watched until he vanished into the distance. The wind stirred faintly in the trees, and the glow of the hearth drew them back inside. Ernest stood by the fire a moment, silent, his gaze fixed upon the embers. Then he turned to his mother, his eyes calm and clear. She gathered him into her arms, her heart still tremulous, yet sustained by hope. March arrived with a sky both gray and restless, as though the season wavered between winter's grip and the first breath of spring. The snow yet lingered across the fields, though patches of dark earth appeared where the wind had swept it bare. The Whitmore farm lay in quiet order, its daily round moving steadily, though beneath the calmness, Margaret's heart remained troubled. She had watched Ernest closely through the weeks since Webb's last visit. The boy performed his tasks faithfully, spoke gently, and shared in the common life of the household. Yet she saw now and again the far look in his eyes when he read too long or paused at the window in silence. Though he returned quickly when spoken to, the memory of his earlier withdrawal made her anxious. Thus, when Webb's carriage came once more up the frozen track on the 4th of March, she felt both relief and dread at his arrival. Thomas met the physician with his usual firmness of manner. "Good day, Webb. Thou art welcome again." Yo, and I am glad to return, the doctor answered, stepping down with care. The two men entered, their breath still visible in the sharp air, and were received at once by Margaret, who had risen to greet them. Ernest stood by the hearth, his hands folded, his gaze calm yet thoughtful as he acknowledged the visitor with quiet respect. After brief courtesies, Webb requested to speak again with the lad alone. Margaret hesitated, but Thomas laid a steady hand upon her arm. "It is for his good," he whispered. With a sigh, she withdrew, her glance lingering upon her son until the door closed. The room grew silent, save for the faint crackling of the fire. Webb seated himself, motioning for Ernest to take the chair opposite. He studied the boy for a moment before speaking. "Well, Ernest, how hast thou passed the weeks since last we conversed?" The boy answered in a tone. "Peacefully, sir. I labor each day with father. I read when the work is done, and I sleep soundly at night. The heaviness has not returned. Thou art certain?" Webb pressed gently. "No spells of silence? No moments when the world around thee seems as naught?" "Not as before," Ernest replied. "At times I think deeply, yet I do not lose myself. If mother calls, I hear. If father bids me, I rise. It is as though I walk upon a path of thought, but I still see the way back." Ew. The physician nodded slowly. "And what thoughts have filled thy mind in these wanderings?" Ew. The boy's gaze brightened faintly. "I see how numbers fit together, how words carry meaning beyond themselves, and how the stars in the heavens keep their order. It is as though all things are bound by one great design, though I cannot name it. I follow where it leads, yet it is not fearful." Webb listened intently, his hands folded upon his knee. "Thy reflections are keen, yet thou art still young. Such weight of thought can weary the spirit if it be not balanced. Tell me, dost thou take joy in the simple company of thy family?" "I do, sir," Ernest said. "I laugh with my sisters, and I speak with father at the table. Mother asks me to help her with small things, and I do so gladly. I am not unwilling to be among them." "That is well," Webb replied. "It is no ill thing to think deeply, but one must not dwell only in the inward chamber. Fellowship, labor, and rest, these are also needed, lest the mind grow overburdened." The boy inclined his head. "I will remember." For a moment, Webb regarded him in silence, as though weighing the lad's words against his countenance. At length he said, "Thy health is sound. I find no ailment either of body or spirit. Thy thoughts run swiftly, but they are not wild. So long as thou keepest balance, I see no cause for fear." He rose then, calling Thomas and Margaret back into the room. Margaret entered quickly, her eyes fixed upon Ernest. "How is he, sir?" she asked, her voice low yet eager. Webb answered with calm assurance. "The boy remains strong. Shh. His body thrives, his spirit is tranquil. The gift of his mind is unusual, yet it is not disease. Continue as before. Give him his studies, but draw him often into the labors and joys of the household. Thus will he remain safe." Margaret pressed a hand to her breast, tears welling in her eyes. "Thy words bring comfort, though my heart will always watch." Thomas grasped the physician's hand firmly. "We thank thee. Thy counsel is plain, and we shall follow it." Webb took his leave shortly after, his carriage carrying him once more down the snowbound road. The family stood at the door, watching until he disappeared beyond the curve. Then they returned to the warmth of the hearth, where the fire glowed against the encroaching dusk. Ernest sat quietly near the flames, his face calm, his manner composed. Margaret, watching him, felt the mingling of hope and fear still strong within her, yet steadied by the physician's words. Thomas placed a hand upon her shoulder, and together they kept silent vigil as the twilight deepened. The days crept on toward the equinox, when winter loosens its hold, though the snow yet lies deep upon the ground. March winds rattled against the eaves of the Whitmore home, carrying with them the faintest scent of thawing earth. The world seemed suspended between two seasons, and within the farmhouse, Margaret's heart felt the same, held between hope and fear. Since Webb's last visit, she had kept unceasing watch over her son. Ernest labored diligently with his father, shouldered the tasks set before him, and bore himself with composure. At table, he joined in the family's talk. With his sisters, he shared mild cheer, reading aloud or walking with them when the air allowed. And yet there were moments when Margaret caught in his eyes that distant light, a brightness turned inward, as though he gazed upon something unseen. He returned when spoken to, yet the memory of darker days made her cling to every small sign. Thus, when the carriage wheels once more approached along the still frozen lane on the 20th of March, Margaret's spirit fluttered like a bird half-caged. Thomas went out to meet Dr. Webb, who descended from his seat with the steady composure of one well accustomed to the care of troubled hearts. "Good day, Thomas," he said, clasping the farmer's hand. "And to thee, Webb," Thomas answered. "Thou art welcome." They entered together, greeted by the familiar warmth of the fire and Margaret's anxious courtesy. Ernest rose from his place near the window where he had been reading, and acknowledged the visitor with quiet respect. Webb's gaze lingered upon the lad before he laid aside his cloak. "I would speak with Ernest once more, if thou art willing," he said. "Bosh up a pole, black show." Margaret hesitated, but Thomas gave her a reassuring glance. "Let the doctor do his part." "Wife, it is for the boy's good." With a sigh she yielded, and withdrew with Thomas into the adjoining room. Ernest remained standing, the book closed in his hands. "Come, lad," Webb said gently, motioning to a chair. "Let us speak together as before. Tell me, how hast thou fared these weeks past?" Ernest sat, his hands resting upon his knees. "I have fared well, sir. I labor daily, and I take rest when it is given. My mind is full, yet it does not trouble me as it once did." Webb studied him with searching eyes. "Full in what manner? Describe it to me." The boy's gaze lifted slightly, as though he sought words equal to his thought. "When I read, I see not only the words but the order beneath them. When I reckon numbers, I see how they abound one to another, endless and exact. When I look upon the stars, I think how each keeps its place in silence. It seems all things are joined in one great pattern. Sometimes the thought of it is so vast, I lose measure of time." Yet, Webb asked, "dost thou lose thyself in it still, as before when thy mother feared thou wouldst not return from such reflections?" Ernest shook his head. "No, sir. If my name is called, I hear it. If a task is set before me, I rise to it. It is as though I walk a long road of thought, yet I know the way back." The physician leaned forward, his tone steady. "And how dost thou feel when thou returnest? Weary? Confused?" "No, sir. I feel quiet. My heart is at rest, though my mind is full." Webb regarded him a moment in silence. The boy's words bore no trace of disorder, and his manner was composed. Yet the physician's task was not only to judge the present, but to guard against what might come. Ernest," he said at length, "thy gift of thought is uncommon. Few at thy age perceive such depth. Yet hear me well, even gifts must be tempered. Thou must never let thy inward meditations estrange thee from those who love thee. Thy family's fellowship, the work of thy hands, the common duties of life, these will keep thy spirit balanced." "I understand," the boy answered earnestly. "I do not wish to grieve them." Webb's expression softened. "And thou dost not. Indeed, they watch thee with love, though it is a love mixed with fear. Their care is thy safeguard as well as thy burden. Accept it with patience." "I will, sir," Ernest said. Satisfied, Webb called Thomas and Margaret back. They entered quickly, Margaret's eyes searching her son's face, as though to read there the physician's judgment. "How is he, sir?" she asked. Webb folded his hands behind his back. His voice measured. The boy continues sound. His thoughts run deep, yet they are not disordered. His body is strong, his spirit tranquil. What he needs is not remedy but guidance. Permit him his studies, yet draw him often into thy company. Let him labor, laugh, and share the household life. Thus he shall keep safe." Margaret clasped her hands tightly, tears rising to her eyes. Thy words bring relief, though a mother's heart cannot cease from watching. Thomas gave a grave nod. We shall heed thy counsel, he shall not be left to himself. The physician gathered his cloak and gloves. Then my part is lightened. I will return as need arises, but I believe love and steady care are his best defense. He departed into the brisk March air, his carriage creaking along the half-thawed road until it vanished from sight. Within the house, silence lingered for a time. Margaret drew Ernest close, holding him with quiet fervor. Thomas laid a firm hand upon the boy's shoulder, his eyes steady yet softened. Ernest bore their care with gentle composure. He stood calm beneath their gaze, his manner neither burdened nor indifferent, but as one who accepted both the weight of love and the quiet strength it gave. As twilight deepened and the fire burned low, the family gathered close, sustained by the physician's words and by their own steadfast bond. The warmth of May lay gently upon the Whitmore farm, softening the earth and clothing the meadows in tender green. The river ran full from melted snows, and the orchards spread their blossoms like clouds held close to the boughs. Birds darted through the air with tireless song, and the long hush of winter seemed truly broken. Within the farmhouse, the family moved in quiet rhythm. The cares of recent months had left their mark, yet time and the constancy of daily duty lent a healing balm. Ernest applied himself diligently to his father's work, rising at dawn, shouldering his share of the plough and hoe, earning water from the well. When labor was ended, he would often sit with a book, his brow calm, his eyes luminous. His sisters drew near to listen, though many a passage soared above their youthful understanding. Margaret, watching, felt mingled pride and unease. Thus, when the 15th day of May brought again the figure of Dr. Webb up the winding road, her heart rose into her throat. Thomas stepped out to greet the carriage, his manner steady, though beneath his reserve he also longed for reassurance. "A good day to thee, Thomas," Webb said, descending with his customary composure. "And good day to thee, Doctor," Thomas replied, clasping his hand. "The season is kinder now, yet we welcome thy counsel more than ever. Ute?" Within, Margaret had set the room in order, though no arrangement could still the tremor of her hands. Ernest came forward, tall and straight, with the glow of health upon his cheek from hours in the fields. He offered the physician a courteous bow. "Well met, Ernest," Webb said kindly. "I am pleased to find thee in good form. Wilt thou sit with me again, that we may converse a while?" The boy nodded. Margaret lingered a moment, reluctant to leave, but Thomas gently guided her away, and soon the two were left alone. Webb studied the lad in silence for a moment, noting the evenness of his breath, the clarity of his gaze. "Tell me, Ernest, how hast thou spent these last weeks?" "I have labored, sir," Ernest replied. "The fields claim much strength, yet the work is wholesome. I read when the day is done, and sometimes I walk the orchard at dusk. My mind is often full, but I am not troubled. What thoughts chiefly fill it?" Ernest paused, folding his hands. "I think of how things grow. The seed is small, yet within it lies the measure of the tree. The sun draws it upward, the rain nourishes it, and in due season it bears fruit. It is the same with numbers, with words, with all that lives. They unfold from what was hidden. The thought makes me glad, though sometimes it overwhelms me." "Overwhelms thee?" Webb leaned slightly forward, "Only in size, sir, not in strangeness. The world seems vast and orderly, and I feel small within it, yet I do not lose myself. I remain, and I return to my family when called." The physician nodded slowly. "That is well. It is not wrong to perceive the greatness of things, provided it does not estrange thee from thy duties. Hast thou been steady with thy tasks?" "Yes, sir. My father entrusts me with much, and I strive not to fail him." Webb observed the boy's calm manner, the measured tone of his speech. There was fervor in Ernest's eyes, but not disorder. The balance of outward labor and inward reflection seemed to steady him. "Ernest," Webb said at length, "thou hast a keen mind, but thou must always remember that thy body and thy spirit require rest as well as exertion. Too much study, too much inward musing, may weary thee unseen. Wilt thou promise me to keep moderation in all things? I will, sir, Ernest replied earnestly. A satisfied Webb rose and called for the parents. Margaret entered swiftly, searching her son's face before fixing her gaze upon the physician. "Well, sir?" she asked. Webb placed his hands calmly before him. Thy son thrives, his body is sound, his mind clear. He perceives much, yet he does not wander beyond recall. Continue as thou hast done, let him labor with thee, let him share in the cheer of home, and grant him his reading in measure. Thus, I believe he will remain steady. Margaret pressed her hand to her breast, relief softening her features. God be thanked, she whispered. Thomas inclined his head. We shall hold him to a path both useful and moderate. Thy counsel is plain, and we will follow it. Ernest, standing quietly, met his mother's gaze with a reassuring smile. Though her heart trembled still, she felt the strength in his presence. Webb gathered his cloak once more. I shall not weary thee with needless visits, if matters continue thus. But remember, if ever thou art troubled, send word, and I will return. With that, he departed into the mild spring air, leaving the family together in their farmhouse. Margaret clasped Ernest's hand and would not let it go until the shadows lengthened and the lamp was lit. Thomas spoke little, but his firm glance told his son more than words could, that duty and family bound him securely, as surely as earth and root bind the growing tree. The harvest months approached, painting the fields in hues of gold and russet. The air held both the fragrance of ripened fruit and the first sharp breath of coming frost. Upon the Whitmore farm, all was movement and purpose, for the gathering of crops required every hand, and each member of the household bent willingly to the task. Ernest took his place beside his father, strong of arm and tireless in spirit. The rhythm of the scythe and the heft of the sheaf, no stranger to him now. Yet, when twilight fell and the tools were laid aside, his mind turned again to its quiet pursuits. The boy sat with his books, his candle casting a small but steadfast flame upon the worn pages. He read with care, not hurriedly, pausing often to reflect. His sisters, drawn by his gentle voice, lingered in the glow, listening as he repeated aloud passages of history or philosophy, his tone steady, his meaning plain. Margaret watched from her chair with mingled wonder and unease. She saw in her son both the ploughman's strength and the scholar's bearing, and though pride stirred her, fear also whispered. On the 20th day of September, Dr. Webb again ascended the road to the farmhouse. His visits, though less frequent, still brought the family a mixture of relief and anxiety. Margaret's hands trembled as she arranged the hearth, while Thomas remained outwardly calm, though his eyes betrayed anticipation. Ernest himself seemed untroubled, greeting the physician with the same composed courtesy as before. You well met, Ernest, Webb said, extending his hand. The autumn air is bracing, yet I find thee looking well. I am well, sir, Ernest replied simply. Then let us sit and converse once more. They withdrew to the familiar parlor. The physician seated himself with quiet dignity, and Ernest took his place opposite, folding his hands as if to prepare for discourse. Tell me, Webb began, how hast thou fared since last we spoke? Your waters Samswin fared the last we spoke? Hast thou kept the balance of work and thought as we agreed? Yes, sir, Ernest answered. The fields claim much of me, and I give them my strength. But when the evening comes, I read. The words seem clearer now, and I am less carried away by them. I pause to consider and then return to the world about me. Webb nodded with satisfaction. That is well. What subjects chiefly engage thee? History, sir, and the lives of men who have shaped nations. I read also of the natural world, of plants and stars. The order of it all amazes me, yet I do not lose myself as before. I see that each thing has its appointed time and place. The physician regarded him closely. And thy duties, art thou faithful to them still? I am, sir. My father trusts me with much, and I strive not to fail him. The work steadies me, as you said it would. Excellent, Webb replied. It is no shame to possess a lively mind, provided it is anchored in labor and family. Thou hast both, and I perceive the fruit of it in thy composure. Ernest inclined his head, a faint smile touching his lips. Margaret, listening beyond the door, caught the note of calm and felt her heart ease. Yet Webb, cautious by nature, did not leave the matter wholly at rest. "Ernest," he said gravely, "remember always that thy thoughts are but guests in the house of thy spirit. Do not allow them to master thee. Hold fast to the tasks of each day, and let thy reflections serve thee, not rule thee. Wilt thou promise me this?" "Keo, I will, sir," Ernest said earnestly. "Satisfied!" Webb called for the parents. Thomas entered with measured step, and Margaret followed swiftly, her eyes fixed upon the physician. "Well, doctor?" she asked, her voice scarcely above a whisper. Webb met her gaze with calm assurance. "Thy son prospers. His frame is sound, his mind steady. He has heeded counsel, and I see no cause for alarm. Continue to guide him with firmness and kindness, and I trust he will remain as he is." Margaret pressed her hand to her lips, tears springing unbidden to her eyes. "We thank thee," she murmured. Thomas inclined his head. "We shall keep him diligent in work and moderate in study. Thy words shall not be forgotten." Ernest looked upon his parents with affection, his calm smile answering their silent fears. In that moment, Margaret felt both relief and awe. Her son stood before her, not only as a boy, but as one growing into his own measure, his path lit by both toil and thought. When Webb departed at last, the September dusk gathered over the fields, the sky streaked with crimson. The family lingered at the door, watching until the physician's figure vanished into the distance. Then they returned within, their hearts lighter than before, strengthened by the quiet assurance that the season ahead, though full of labor, would also bring peace. Winter lay thick upon the valley. The meadows lay buried beneath a cloak of white, and the trees stood bare, their branches etched against the pale sky. Smoke curled steadily from the Whitmore chimney, and within the farmhouse warmth and industry reigned. The family kept close together, their labors confined largely indoors, where the hum of spinning wheel and the crackle of the hearth filled the rooms. Ernest bore the season with a quiet strength. His frame had broadened with labor, and though his hands were roughened, there remained about him an air of calm thoughtfulness. Each morning he joined his father in tending to the cattle, carrying water through the snow and splitting wood for the fire. Yet, when these duties were completed, he returned to his books. His sisters often gathered at his side, charmed by his gentle explanations and the cadence of his voice. Margaret, watching from her chair, felt both pride and the faint echo of her former anxieties. On the 28th day of December, Dr. Webb once more made his appearance at the farm. The sight of his figure, advancing through the snow, stirred old apprehensions in Margaret's breast, though she sought to master them. Thomas greeted the physician with his customary steadiness, leading him into the warm interior. Ernest rose respectfully, setting aside his book, and offered a quiet bow. "Good day to thee, Ernest," Webb said kindly, brushing the snow from his cloak. "I trust the winter has not weighed heavily upon thee." "It has not, sir," Ernest replied. "There is work enough to fill the hours, and when the day is done, I study a little. Then let us sit," Webb said, motioning toward the familiar parlor. They seated themselves, the fire casting a ruddy glow upon the walls. Webb regarded the lad with careful eyes. "Tell me, Ernest, how fares thy spirit in these colder months?" "I am content, sir. Dapper be you that report," Ernest answered. "The days are short, yet they are full. I labor with my father. I read when I may, and I feel no unrest. Of what dost thou chiefly read?" "Coat of the stars, sir, and of their courses. They shine so steadily though the nights are long. It comforts me to think that their order never fails." Webb smiled faintly. "And dost thou lose thyself in these musings as once before?" Ernest shook his head. "No, sir. I think upon them, but I return quickly to my tasks. The stars are high, but the firewood is near, and I know my duty lies first with the wood." The physician nodded approvingly. "That is wisely said. It is not wrong to admire the heavens, but a man must keep his feet upon the earth. Hast thou been faithful to thy household duties? Echo, yes, sir. My father relies on me, and I strive not to fail him. Ill. Webb studied the boy a moment longer, noting the quiet confidence of his manner. Ernest, I perceive a steadiness in thee that was not so firm a year past. Thou hast found balance between thy inward thoughts and thy outward labors. Keep to this path, and thou wilt do well. I will, sir, Ernest replied, his eyes earnest. Webb then called for the parents. Margaret entered swiftly, her gaze fixed upon her son before turning anxiously to the physician. Thomas followed with measured calm. Well, doctor? Margaret asked, scarcely breathing. Webb folded his hands. Be at peace. Thy son is sound in body and composed in mind. He has heeded counsel, and I see no cause for alarm. Continue to guide him as thou hast done, and I trust he will remain steady. Margaret's face softened, tears brightening her eyes. She clasped Ernest's hand, pressing it against her cheek. Thomas inclined his head, his voice firm yet quiet. We thank thee, doctor. Thy words bring comfort to this house. The visit ended with warmth. Webb departed into the cold night, his figure soon lost in the falling snow. All within, the family drew close to the hearth. Ernest read aloud from his book, his voice calm and steady, while his sisters listened in rapt attention. Margaret watched, her heart swelling with gratitude. The storm might rage without, but within the farmhouse peace endured. Rooted in the quiet strength of the sun she once feared to lose, the frost at last began to loosen its grip upon the valley. Though patches of snow lingered in shaded hollows, the fields lay softening beneath the first touch of spring. Streams, long silent, broke forth again with murmuring voices, and the air carried the faint scent of thawing earth. The Whitmore farmhouse stood as it had through every season, a place of constancy amid the shifting world. Within its walls, the family kept their accustomed order. Margaret busied herself with tasks of the household, her hands deft though her step had grown slower. Thomas tended to the fields, measuring the soil's readiness for the year's planting. The children lent themselves where they might, filling the rooms with gentle chatter. Amid all, Ernest moved with quiet strength, his tall frame lending ease to every labor, his manner calm and considerate. The boy's thoughts had deepened over the months, yet he bore them not as a burden, but as a companion. He read with moderation, never permitting the printed page to rob him of his duties. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of reflection without excess. The sisters, seated about him of an evening, delighted in his recitations, though they scarcely grasped the fullness of his meaning. Margaret, hearing him, felt the last remnant of her fears subside, replaced by a gratitude too deep for words. On the 5th day of March, a mild sun shone upon the valley, though the wind yet carried the chill of winter. Dr. Webb, faithful in his concern, rode once more to the Whitmore farm. His visits had grown fewer, for the boy's steadiness no longer demanded close watch. Yet he judged it fitting to see the matter through. Margaret greeted him at the door with warmth, touched still by anxious memory. Doctor, she said, thou art welcome. Oh, and how fares the household, Mrs. Whitmore? He asked, stepping within. All is well, sir, she replied, though thou knowest a mother's heart never rests entirely. He gave her a kindly smile. Let us see the lad, then. They entered the parlor, where Ernest sat by the window, a book upon his knee, the pale light falling across his brow. Rising at once, he bowed with quiet respect. Good day, Ernest, Webb said. It pleases me to find thee well.
Shooty fair, well.
I thank thee, sir, Ernest replied. Shall we converse once more, as in times past? If it please thee, sir. They seated themselves, the fire burning low upon the hearth. Webb regarded the youth with steady eyes. Oh, tell me, Ernest, he began, how hast thou spent these months of winter? In work, sir, chiefly. The farm requires constant labor, and I give myself to it. In the evenings I read a little, but no more than suits the time. And what occupies thy thoughts most? The order of things, sir, Ernest answered after a pause. How each season follows another, how the seed lies hidden and then awakens, how men labor together to bring forth bread. It seems to me that life is not meant for idle dreaming, but for faithful duty. Yet the thoughts that come in quiet hours help me to see the duty more clearly. The physician listened with calm approval. That is well said. I perceive in thee a firmness that was less certain when first we met. Thou hast found the balance between inward musing and outward labor. This balance is rare, Ernest, and I commend thee for it. I am grateful, sir, Ernest replied, his tone steady. Tell me truly, Webb continued, dost thou feel any restlessness now, such as once troubled thee? Ernest shook his head. No, sir, I feel peace. The work of each day is enough for me, and my mind no longer urges me beyond it. A long silence followed, filled only by the faint crackle of the hearth. At last, Webb rose and beckoned for the parents. Margaret entered swiftly, her hands clasped, her eyes searching the physician's face. Thomas followed with steady composure, though his glance betrayed quiet concern. "Well, doctor?" Margaret asked, scarcely daring to breathe. Webb looked upon them with calm assurance. "Be at ease. Thy son is sound of body and composed of mind. He has passed through the season of peril, and stands now upon firm ground. I see in him no cause for fear." Margaret pressed her hands together, her eyes filling with tears. "Thanks be," she murmured, her gaze resting upon Ernest. Thomas inclined his head gravely. "We are indebted to thee, doctor, for thy watchful care." "Nay," Webb said gently, "the strength lies in the lad himself and in the guidance of his home. Continue as thou hast begun, and I believe he will prosper in every season." He departed soon after, leaving the family gathered in quiet gratitude. The March sun sank low, gilding the fields with pale gold. Ernest stepped to the threshold, watching as the physician's figure dwindled upon the road. A gentle breeze stirred, carrying with it the promise of spring. Margaret joined him, her hand resting lightly upon his arm. She looked up at her son, tall and steadfast, and the weight of her fears lifted wholly away. In his calm presence, she saw not only the boy she had once feared to lose, but the man he was becoming, measured, diligent, and at peace. The years ahead stretched unseen before them, yet in that moment, surrounded by the hush of early spring, Margaret knew that her son would walk his path with steadiness, guided not by restless fancies, but by the quiet strength that had taken root within him.